There are some silences that seem to breathe. When Isadora Marr died, if death indeed was what claimed her, the world did not shatter as Elwin had imagined it would. There was no thunderclap, no rip in the sky, no dark veil drawn over the sun. The world continued, indifferent and ordinary, which to Elwin felt the greatest offense of all. The baker still opened his shop each morning. Children laughed in the street. Church bells tolled, not for mourning, but to mark the hour. It was as though the very earth had conspired to forget her, but Elwin did not forget. He could not. The quiet in the house they once shared was not the soft, empty hush of absence, it was a presence, heavy and expectant. The kind of silence that leans close in the dark and waits to be heard. They had lived together in the ancestral Marr estate, a brooding structure of stone and ivy that hunched at the edge of a cliff above the North Sea. Time and wind had worn the walls thin, and salt air had yellowed the lace curtains. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and dust, and in winter, the cold crept in even beside the fire. But to Isadora, the place had always felt romantic, eternal, a house that remembers, she used to say, trailing her fingers along the carved banister. Even if the people inside forget. Now the house remembered her in its own way. Her perfume still lingered on the shawl she had left in the music room. A faint handprint remained on the glass pane beside her favorite chair. Even the mirrors, Elwin thought, held a trace of her gaze, as though they missed being looked into. Yet it was the silence that unnerved him most. Not merely the absence of her voice, but the weight of unspoken things. On the day of her burial, Elwin had stood before the gathered mourners in the churchyard, his eyes dry, his mind splintering quietly under the surface. When the final clod of earth thudded against her coffin, something inside him sealed shut. He did not return to her grave. He did not speak her name aloud. But he did not let her go. 2 weeks after the funeral, he had her body exhumed. He gave no public explanation, only a whisper to the undertaker. The press of gold into a trembling hand. The coffin was brought into the house under cover of night. By then, the servants had all been dismissed. No one was left to question the lanternlight flickering past the windows or the dragging sounds through the hall. In the center of the library, where the ceiling arched like a cathedral vault and the shelves towered with ancient medical volumes, Elwin prepared her resting place, a coffin of thick glass, sealed and chilled, set upon a velvet-draped dais. She lay within it like an image from a dream, or a warning from a folk tale. Her skin, pale and bloodless, still bore the faint blush of rouge he had applied with shaking hands. Her dark hair was combed and pinned. Her hands, folded over her chest, held a dried rose. Each evening, Elwin lit candles around her. He spoke to her in whispers. He read aloud from books they once cherished. He told her things he had never dared say when she lived. "You are not gone," he would murmur. "You are only waiting." And then, one night, as the fire crackled low and the wind moaned against the shutters, Elwin heard it, a whisper, not quite sound. Not quite speech. But there, fluttering in the air, just beyond hearing. Like the faint rustle of silk, or the breath between words, he turned his head slowly toward the coffin. The flame in the nearest candle bent sharply, as if drawn by a current. The glass surface of the coffin remained misted with cold, but beneath it. For just an instant, her lips looked parted. He stood frozen, hands trembling, unable to breathe. The silence roared around him. That was when he understood. She was not truly silent, she was listening, and the grave had never truly claimed her. The morning after the whisper, Elwin Marr sat unmoving in the high-backed chair beside the glass coffin, his teacup untouched, the fire long gone to ash. Sunlight filtered reluctantly through the tall windows, drawing pale bars across the dusty floor. A single moth circled the extinguished chandelier, as though drawn to a memory of light. He had not slept. He did not dare. The whisper had been faint, so faint it might have been imagined. But it had stirred something beneath the surface of his mind, something ancient and primal. In the sterile language of his profession, it might have been called auditory hallucination, an echo born of grief. But Elwin did not think so. He had heard the voice. Not the words, no, but the voice, Isadora's voice. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to speak her name aloud. It cracked in his throat like a dry leaf. Isadora. There was no reply, only the familiar creak of the house settling into itself. Yet something about the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was attentive. He rose unsteadily and moved closer to the coffin. There she lay, as serene as ever. Her beauty unspoiled by time or decay. He had taken every precaution. The embalming had been meticulous, the glass sealed against air, the interior chilled by coils he himself had designed in his days as a medical researcher. She would not rot. She would not be corrupted. She would remain, as she had been on their final night together, immaculate, still, and listening. Elwin pressed his fingertips to the glass. Cold met skin. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker in her eyelids. But it passed. Was it madness? Was it guilt? He had treated cases like this before, men broken by the death of a wife or child, conjuring voices, phantoms, dreams that lingered long into daylight. He had written scholarly articles on the phenomenon, attributing it to unresolved grief and the brain's longing for pattern. But this felt different. It was not he who reached for her, it was she who reached for him. The voice returned 3 nights later. This time, it came not as a whisper, but a sound more structured, a syllable, perhaps, soft and wet, like lips forming the start of his name. The fire flared without cause. The window panes shuddered in their frames. And once again, the candle nearest the coffin leaned violently toward her. Elwin staggered back, breath catching in his throat. His heart hammered in his chest like a madman's fist on a locked door. That night, he descended into the cellar. There, beyond crates of forgotten wine and the ancient anatomy diagrams left by his grandfather, stood a narrow door few in the household had ever opened. It led to the private archives, a chamber where he kept his most sensitive texts, rare tomes, banned translations, and centuries-old medical journals that blurred the line between science and sorcery. He unlocked the door with trembling fingers and stepped into the cold, paper-scented dark. Here, he began to study. Each day, he returned to her side to speak in calm tones, to whisper fragments of poems and prayers. Each night, he searched for a way to pierce the veil between life and death. He read the grim theories of Paracelsus, the obsessions of Mesmer, the ink-smeared diaries of men who believed that spirit and flesh could be teased apart like fibers from a cloth. He found references to sympathetic resonance, to ectoplasmic vessels, to spiritual anchors. And always, the same warning repeated like a refrain in those moldering pages: do not call what cannot rest. Do not stir what has been silenced. But what if she was not at rest? What if she was trying to speak? By the 5th week, he had cleared the furniture from the library and drawn a wide circle of salt and ash around her coffin. He placed symbols on the floor, remembered from half-forgotten lectures in Vienna. From texts he had once scoffed at in his youth. He placed her locket, a simple silver heart containing a miniature portrait of them both, at the head of the coffin. The air inside the house thickened. Candles guttered at random. He began to hear footsteps on the stairs when he was alone. And in the deep hours of the night, when the wind screamed down the chimney like a dying man, he would sometimes wake to find the glass of the coffin fogged from within. She was not sleeping, she was waiting, and each time she spoke, always in half-formed whispers, always just beyond hearing, his heart grew colder, and his mind more certain. This was no echo, it was her, but if her spirit still lingered, why? He dared not say it aloud, not even to himself. But the thought clawed at the edges of his mind like a rat behind a wall. Perhaps Isadora had not died by fate's indifferent hand, perhaps someone had helped her along the path to the grave, and perhaps, just perhaps, she remembered. The rain began on the 12th night. It did not fall softly, as it often had in Isadora's time, pattering against the panes like fingers tapping for entrance. No, this rain came like a siege, slashing sideways against the windows, churning the soil into black pulp, drumming on the slate roof with such fury that the portraits in the upper hall trembled in their frames. Elwin did not sleep, by then. His meals had dwindled to occasional bites of bread, his hands shook when lifting the matches to light the candelabra, and his face, once handsome in a quiet, bookish way, had grown hollow-cheeked and feverish. The servants had long since gone, dismissed or frightened away by the unnatural rituals and the stench of oil and wax that clung to the house. Only Elwin remained, and her, Isadora. He spoke to her constantly now. Not just at dusk, but at all hours, long monologues about memories, regrets, promises once made. Sometimes, he recited poems she had loved. Sometimes, he simply sat near the glass and whispered things he had never told a soul. The sound of his own voice comforted him. Even as it grew dry and cracked, but the whispers had changed, they no longer emerged randomly from the silence. Now, they answered. One night, as he murmured a passage from La Vita Nuova, he paused to rest his voice, and from across the library came a single word, clear and unmistakable: liar. Elwin turned so sharply he knocked over the inkwell. The black fluid spread across the desk like blood in water. He stared at the glass coffin. She had not moved. Her eyes remained closed, her hands folded, her lips pale, yet the word lingered in the air. It had been her voice. Cold, low, measured. Accusing. The next morning, Elwin tore through her belongings. Every drawer, every wardrobe, every stack of letters and photographs. His hands were frantic, eyes wide and red-rimmed. He pawed through the velvet-lined jewelry box she had once treasured. Overturned her collection of pressed flowers, unwrapped the scented sachets she had tucked into drawers. He searched not for a keepsake, but for evidence, and at last, he found it, beneath a false panel in her escritoire, a desk she had guarded jealously in life. He uncovered a slender volume bound in red Moroccan leather. The edges were brittle with age and handling. When he opened it, the scent of lavender and ink drifted up like a ghost sigh. It was her diary. The entries began innocently enough, brief reflections, descriptions of daily tasks, small affections. But as the weeks wore on, a darker tone crept in. Mentions of headaches, of dreams filled with drowning and fire. Allusions to locked doors, to Elwin's long hours in the basement laboratory, to vials and powders she did not recognize. Then, midway through the book, Elwin's name began to appear more often, no longer as my love or Elwin, but simply he. Each entry became shorter. Fear bled between the lines. He says the medicine is to help me sleep. But I have never slept so heavily before. And always, I wake confused. The clocks do not match. I am losing time. I found a mark on my wrist today. A small wound, as if from a needle. He swore it was nothing. I do not believe him. If I die, no. When I die, it will not be nature that claims me. The final page bore a single sentence, written in a hand that faltered near the end. As if strength had failed, I will not be quiet. Elwin closed the book slowly, his hands were cold, the diary slid from his lap to the floor, pages splaying like a dead bird's wings. He sat in the center of the library for a long time, staring at the glass coffin. She lay exactly as before, yet something in her expression, no, in his understanding of it, had changed. The gentle line of her mouth now seemed tight with judgment. Her closed eyes looked more like a refusal than a rest. He remembered those final weeks too well, how pale she had become, how often she drifted into sleep mid-conversation, how her voice had grown slurred. He had explained it all away. Stress, he said. Melancholia. A touch of hysteria. He had given her tinctures to ease her mind, tonics to restore her balance. He had meant to help. Hadn't he, or had he loved her so much he needed her silenced, preserved in amber, forever passive, forever his? Lightning split the sky outside, briefly illuminating the room in ghastly white. The glass coffin flashed like a mirror, and in that flash, for just an instant, he saw her eyes, open, unblinking, staring back. He screamed. When he returned to himself, the storm had passed. He was on the floor, the fire had gone out, and the diary lay beside him, pages fluttering gently in the breeze from the broken window. Isadora's voice came again. Soft, steady, unmistakable, remember me. For 3 days Elwin did not eat. He moved through the manor like a ghost of himself, silent, brittle, and drawn toward shadows as though the light offended him. The diary remained clutched in one hand, dog-eared and darkened where his fingers sweated through the binding. He carried it with the reverence of a sacred text and the fear of a condemned man. At dawn on the 4th day, he lit every candle in the house, the chandelier, the sconces, the tapers on the stairwells, all blazed in amber rows that licked the walls with flickering tongues. The windows he covered with heavy velvet, sealing out the sun. The library, once a quiet retreat of literature and anatomy, now pulsed with an atmosphere thick and oppressive. As though something ancient had awakened there and refused to leave, she had spoken again, twice. The first time, Elwin had been walking past the music room, her music room, where dust now veiled the polished keys of her pianoforte. He had paused, hearing what he thought was a breath drawn in surprise. Then came the whisper, "You drugged me." He had not replied. There was nothing to say. The second time, he had been reading aloud to her. The poem was Browning's Porphyria's Lover, and he had chosen it without thinking, drawn, perhaps, by a subconscious need to confess. When he finished the final line, the voice answered, "You killed me slower." Elwin had dropped the book. It struck the floor like a gavel. He knew now that the barrier between their worlds was thinning. He could feel it in the way objects moved on their own, the candlestick that slid across the mantel, the clock that ticked backwards from midnight to noon. And in the silence between the gusts of wind, there were other sounds. Wet sounds. Sounds like soft hands pressing against glass, and yet, he could not stop. What he felt now was not horror, but hope. A twisted, vile hope that she might come back, if only he went far enough. If only he opened the right gate, whispered the right word, undid the damage. or shared in it, he returned to the cellar. This time, he brought with him a vial of his own blood. It had not been easy to extract, his hands were not steady, and the syringe had resisted, but the result gleamed dark and thick under the oil lamp. In the center of the floor, he cleared away dust and relics and etched a new circle, this one deeper, scored into the stone with a surgical scalpel. Around it, he placed objects of meaning, the diary, her brush, a locket containing a strand of her hair, and one of her gloves, still faintly scented with violet. Then he opened the book he had vowed never to touch, The Black Doctrine of Erasmus Walden, a volume banned even in his most occult circles. Bound in cracked human skin, its pages were not printed, but written in a script that seemed to shift as he read, changing just slightly with each glance. As if resisting interpretation, but Elwin read. He read until his vision blurred and the air tasted of iron. When he spoke the invocation, a guttural language older than civilization, his voice trembled, but held, the circle pulsed, candles flared, then went out, the walls breathed, and then, her voice, not a whisper this time, not a breath, but a scream, not of fear, of pain. Elwin fell to his knees, clutching his head. The scream pierced him not through the ears, but from within. Like her agony had rooted in the back of his skull, grown tendrils through his thoughts. Then the voice fell silent, but in the darkness, something remained. He heard weeping, it came from the library. He rushed there, candle shaking in his grasp, and stopped cold. The coffin was open, the glass lid had been slid aside as though moved by an unseen hand. Inside, Isadora still lay, but her face had turned toward him, though her eyes remained shut. Her hair, once neatly arranged, had spilled across the pillow in disarray. One arm now rested along her side. The other had moved. Her pale hand reached toward the edge of the coffin, fingers slightly curled, as if grasping at something. Elwin staggered back. Had he done this? Had she? He dared not touch her. Instead, he stood at a distance, breath shallow, candle sputtering. His reflection danced in the curve of the glass. And from the shadows, her voice spoke once more, not a whisper, not a scream, but a statement, "You brought me back. But I am not alone." The room was still, or, at least, it appeared still. Elwin stood frozen, his gaze locked upon Isadora, her body now seated in the coffin, her hands pressing against the edge as though she struggled to lift herself, to escape the encasement that once held her in pristine stasis. Her lips had parted, but no sound emerged. Her once porcelain skin had turned an ashen gray, but there was a faint warmth to her that Elwin could not ignore. It was as though the last breath of life had been sparked in her again, like an ember reigniting in the dark. But the silence, that silence, remained, and in it, something else stirred. The shadows. At first, they were only vague shapes, soft ripples along the edges of the room where the candlelight failed to penetrate. Then, as the air grew heavy with each passing moment, they began to coalesce, darkening, thickening. Slowly, like ink bleeding into water, they rose from the corners of the room, pooling near the coffin, twisting in unnatural patterns. It was not her, this was not the woman he had loved. Isadora was trapped inside the prison of her body, her features locked in an expression of agonized stillness, her once glowing eyes now dull beneath their closed lids. She could not move, could not speak. But something else, something dark, had come with her. Elwin's breath hitched. The shadows pressed in on him, crawling like sentient smoke, winding through the air in serpentine coils, thick and suffocating. They whispered, soft voices, not hers, undulating around his mind like a terrible lullaby. "You woke us." The words were like a sigh, Heavy with regret and hunger, Elwin staggered back, his chest tightening with panic, but there was nowhere to flee. The room had become a trap, a suffocating tomb, and he could feel his pulse in his throat, racing, as though his very blood were attempting to flee from him. Isadora. He spoke her name, but his voice sounded distant, foreign in his own ears. The shadows twitched and expanded, coiling tighter around the glass coffin, wrapping like claws around her unmoving form. In the flickering candlelight, he could see the outlines of faces, of twisted features not quite human, lips that had not seen a smile in centuries, eyes that were closed forever, hands reaching from the dark, and they were all tethered to her. She had never been alone in the grave. He had not brought her back alone. There had been others. He reached for her, instinctively, desperate to pull her from the coffin, to break the unseen force that held her trapped. But his fingers only brushed against the glass, which pulsed beneath his touch, warm to the skin, yet impossibly cold to the soul. His hand trembled. "Isadora," he whispered again, almost pleading, and in response, she opened her eyes. But it was not the warm, loving gaze he had once adored. It was the cold stare of an ancient thing that had seen too much. Her eyes, those eyes, were not hers. They were hollow, dark, endless. Eyes that had witnessed centuries of suffering and death. Eyes that had seen more than a living soul should ever be asked to bear, and as her mouth parted, it was not her voice that spoke, but the voice of the shadows, the ones that had clung to her in death. "You brought us here," they murmured in chorus. The voice was not one, but many, 1,000 whispers all sewn together in a single breath. "You freed us from the tomb. And now we are free to walk among the living once more." The shadows surged toward him, rising in waves of ink and dark matter, pressing in around his body, engulfing him. The air grew thick and heavy with a terrible presence, the heat from the candles flickering and warping, shadows stretching unnaturally long and thin, and in that moment, Elwin understood. He had not only woken Isadora. He had disturbed something older, something that had remained buried for a reason. Something that had clung to her even in death, feeding off the darkness, feeding off the grief that had filled her final moments. They had been bound to her, and now they were bound to him. He staggered back, falling to the floor, but the darkness followed. The voices churned inside his mind, like 1,000 rats gnawing at his thoughts. "You freed us," they whispered again. "But you will not survive us." And then, just as quickly as it had come, the darkness receded. Elwin was left in the library, trembling, his heart pounding as though it were about to rip itself from his chest. The shadows no longer loomed, but the air still felt thick and alive, as though it were vibrating with a hidden presence. The candles had blown out, the room dark now, the faint smell of burned wick lingering in the stillness, but in the coffin, she was still there. Her eyes had closed once more, the lid of the coffin creaked, as though shifting under an invisible weight. Elwin staggered to his feet, his mind swirling with madness. He could feel something, someone, watching him now, not from the shadows, but from within the glass, and he knew, with a cold clarity, that Isadora was not the one he had to fear. It was what she had brought back, and it was already moving. Elwin could no longer remember the days. They blended into one another, streaked together in a chaotic mess of fevered nights and delirious dawns. Time had lost its meaning. He had not seen sunlight in what felt like weeks, though the manor's narrow windows revealed only a smudge of gray. Every hour seemed to be as dark and cold as the next. His mind, too, seemed to turn in on itself, endlessly spiraling into deeper madness, until he could no longer tell where the nightmares ended and his waking hours began. The coffin was no longer still. In the moments when the house fell into silence, Elwin swore that he could hear the glass creak, a faint scraping sound that would send his heart racing. Each time he dared to approach, the room would feel colder, the shadows thicker, pressing in from every corner. The walls seemed to breathe, and the air was suffused with the taste of something ancient, like dust, mildew, and something much darker. Something that had been buried and forgotten for far too long. He could not escape it. The house had become a prison of his own making, and the terrible presence, them, had followed him everywhere. They whispered in his ears at night, their voices indistinguishable from the wind that howled through the eaves. At times, they crowded into the corners of his vision, figures half-formed, faces twisted in perpetual agony, but the worst of it was always Isadora, the woman he had loved, whose body he had sworn to preserve. She had changed. And Elwin knew, deep within his very marrow, that she was no longer simply dead. She was a vessel that had opened the door to the horrors he had invited into his life. She had not been reborn, she had been claimed. The eyes that once shone with life now only reflected the shadows. Her lips, once red, were now a dull gray, like the lifelessness that had taken root inside of her. Her breath, if it could still be called breath, came in shallow, ragged gasps, as if struggling against some unseen force. Elwin knew she could not be freed. There was no spell to undo the bond he had formed. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Each time he approached the coffin, the shadows seemed to writhe beneath the glass, their forms shifting, pulsing. He could hear them now, more clearly, these hollow watchers, their voices speaking in unison. You cannot undo it. You cannot take her back. One evening, after hours of pacing through the dark halls, unable to silence the whispers, Elwin made a decision. He had to confront it. He had to go deeper. He had to understand what was happening to her, and what had begun to happen to him. Desperation gnawed at him, and so he ventured to the only place left untouched, the ancient basement, where the rituals had first begun. There, amid the forgotten bottles and jars of chemicals and alchemical curiosities, he found a tome he had not noticed before, bound in cracked leather, stained with age and mystery. It was not a book of resurrection or necromancy. It was something else, something darker. The title, though smudged by time, was legible enough, The Truth Beneath the Veil, a compendium of the Hollow Ones. Elwin opened it. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and the ink had faded in places, but the words remained clear. His hands shook as he read the first passage. They are not the dead who walk. They are the forgotten. The text continued, describing the creation of these creatures, these hollow ones, who had once been men and women but had been consumed by a curse older than time itself. They were the echoes of those who had been unjustly trapped between life and death, left to roam the world as shadows, bound to the places where they had been abandoned, forgotten, or betrayed. To bring back the dead, Elwin read aloud, his voice trembling, is to invite them to take what is not theirs. They become vessels, yes. But the vessels are not their own. The souls that once inhabited them have already been consumed, lost to the dark tide. What remains is not what was once loved. Elwin's throat closed, and his vision blurred. He stumbled backwards, the book slipping from his fingers, its pages fluttering like the wings of an insect caught in a web. His breath was ragged, and the walls of the basement seemed to close in on him, the air thickening, swirling with the odor of earth and decay. He had done it. He had unknowingly given them a way back, the hollow ones. The shadows that now clung to Isadora were no mere figments of his tortured mind. They were real, and they had inhabited her. They had taken her, piece by piece, until she was no more than a puppet, a hollow shell of the woman he had once known, the diary. The ritual. The pact, all had led to this. And now, Elwin understood, he could not save her. He could not bring her back to life. The only thing he had summoned from the grave was not a return of the woman he loved, but the birth of something other. Something that would never be sated, something that would never cease until it had consumed every part of him. The shadows around him began to stir once more. He could hear the faint rustling of cloth, the subtle shift of the air. They were drawing closer, encroaching upon him as they had upon her. "We will never leave," they whispered. Elwin turned toward the stairs, the walls seeming to pulse with his every movement. He could feel their eyes, if they had eyes, on him, pressing against his back. Curling into his thoughts, and then, in the deepest corner of his mind, he heard the voice again. "You brought us here." This time, it was not the shadows that spoke, it was Isadora. Elwin felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow. Her voice was a faint echo, yet it seemed to carry the weight of an ocean. There was something alive in it, but also something infinitely distant, cold and unreachable. He stumbled up the stairs, not daring to look behind him, but the words followed, "You cannot hide. You will never escape." The manor had become a tomb, not the kind of tomb one might expect, silent, still, and suffused with the air of finality. No. This was a tomb that breathed. It shifted. It lived. The house itself had become a conduit, pulsing with the very darkness Elwin had unleashed. It had taken on a malevolent energy, the walls growing warmer, as if feeding off the fear that had begun to spiral out of control inside him. He had tried to leave, he had tried, but it would not let him. The doors refused to open. The windows slammed shut with the ferocity of a storm, the glass rattling as though something unseen were pressing against it from the outside. Elwin had shattered his fists against the doorframe, splintering wood and breaking nails, but still the house had held him captive. Each step he took within its walls was met with the sound of something watching. Following, its presence unmistakable. The air was thick and oppressive, as though every inch of the house were weighed down by the very shadows that had taken root there, and still, she remained. Isadora's body, though not alive, seemed to call to him from the coffin, its presence an aching reminder of his betrayal. The glass lid, though once shattered and cracked, was now whole again, seamless as it had been the moment he had placed her inside. But that was not what troubled him. It was her eyes. Her empty eyes, which would now open at the faintest hint of his approach. The hollow, endless blackness within them seemed to search for him, to accuse him. She no longer spoke. No, the voice that had once belonged to her had been swallowed by the shadows. But the whispers remained, their voices blending with her own, twisting together in an unholy choir. "You cannot escape us." The words were a constant murmur in his mind, gnawing at him like rats in the walls. The silence of the house was not peace, it was an ever-present, suffocating weight, pressing down on him from all sides. He could no longer sleep. He no longer dared to close his eyes, for every time he did, he saw her face, her eyes, those eyes, watching him in the dark. The house had become his prison and his executioner. The shadows were closing in, curling around him like smoke, tightening their grip on his mind, on his soul, and then, in the dead of night, it came. The first sign of what he had truly awakened. He had been sitting in the library, the diary clutched in his hands, poring over its cursed pages again, trying to decipher what could possibly rid him of this nightmare. He had read every word, tried every incantation, but nothing had worked. The shadows only grew stronger. He had read it all before, and yet Something had changed, the pages, those pages, shifted beneath his trembling hands, their ink changing once again, the script growing larger and more frantic, as though the book itself were alive. The words were no longer readable, they had become an indecipherable jumble of symbols, twisting and shifting, like a serpent coiling around his thoughts. And then, a sound, a knock. Faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing through the library, as though it came from deep within the walls themselves, a knock that did not belong. He sprang to his feet, the diary falling from his hands, scattering across the floor. His heart pounded in his chest as the sound continued, louder now, reverberating throughout the house. The walls seemed to groan under the weight of it, as if they were trying to hold back something that wished to escape. He turned toward the door, his breath shallow. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking with a terror he could no longer suppress. "It cannot be." The knock came again, harder this time. Insistent, Elwin stumbled toward the door, his limbs shaking, his mouth dry. He placed his hand on the cold brass handle and twisted it, but the door, like all others in the house, refused to yield. The knocking persisted, now accompanied by a low, guttural sound, as though something, or someone, was trying to force its way through the wood. Elwin's mind raced, his thoughts fragmented. Was it a dream? Had he crossed a line he could not return from? The house, no, the manor, was alive, and it was hungry. With one final, terrified push, Elwin threw the door open, and before him stood nothing but the blackened hallway stretching out like an abyss. But there was something else, something worse than the silence. Something moving. From the shadows, they emerged, figures, no longer bound by the walls or the corners of his mind. The hollow ones had stepped into the world of the living. They were not human, though once they had been. Their forms were distorted, bodies twisted and elongated, faces half-rotten, eyes wide and unblinking, filled with nothing but hunger. They were the forgotten ones, the lost souls who had slipped through the cracks of time, never meant to return. And yet, here they were. Elwin stumbled backward, his chest tightening as they advanced, their eyes fixed on him, empty and all-consuming. The very air around them seemed to pulse with dread. "You released us," they whispered. Their voices a cacophony of agony and rage. "You awoke what should have stayed dead." He turned to flee, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in, narrowing around him like the jaws of a beast. His breath was ragged, his pulse racing, but no matter which direction he took, there was no escape. The house, the manor, was its own prison, and now the hollow ones roamed freely within it. They were everywhere. Watching. Waiting. "You are ours now." The voices came from all directions, no longer whispers, but screams that echoed in his mind, tearing at the edges of his sanity. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, all-consuming. He could feel them closing in on him. Could feel their cold, clammy hands brushing against his skin. They were real, so real, and they were his to bear. Their tortured faces, their hollow eyes, were etched into his mind. Elwin stumbled forward, his legs trembling beneath him, but there was nowhere left to run. "You cannot undo it." The words echoed one final time, and then, the house fell silent, a breathless, oppressive silence, heavier than any grave, and in that silence, the door to the coffin creaked open, Isadora's form shifted within. Her lips parted. She was no longer just a shadow, she had returned, but she was not the woman he had loved, and she was not alone. The silence that followed Isadora's awakening was more dreadful than any noise. It was an oppressive, suffocating hush, as though the entire world had held its breath, waiting for the inevitable, Unwilling to speak or move in fear of what might come next, Elwin stood paralyzed at the doorway, his heart hammering in his chest. He could scarcely comprehend what his eyes beheld. The woman he had loved, the woman whose body he had so painstakingly preserved, was no longer the fragile form that had once lain so still beneath the glass. She had changed, but it was not a simple transformation. No, this was something darker, more insidious. Her eyes, once full of life and warmth, were now pools of absolute blackness. There was no trace of the soul that had once danced behind them. In their place was something else, something ancient and hollow, a vast, endless abyss that seemed to devour all that it touched. Her mouth opened, and a cold, rasping breath emerged. "Elwin," she whispered, but it was not her voice. It was a voice that came from nowhere and everywhere, 1,000 voices merging into one, the mournful cry of the forgotten ones. "You have set us free. But you cannot undo it." The words felt like a death sentence. They carried a weight so heavy that it pressed down on Elwin's chest, choking the air from his lungs. His hands, trembling uncontrollably, reached out as though in an attempt to touch her, to hold her again, to make her his. But as his fingers neared her skin, he recoiled in horror. Her flesh was cold, unnaturally so. It felt like marble, like stone. Her body was an empty vessel, a shell containing only the hollow void of the souls he had released. And she was now one of them, the hollow ones. He had heard their voices before, but now they were here, in her. They had claimed her, just as they had claimed the house, the manor, and the very air he breathed. She was no longer the woman he had loved, she was something else entirely, a creature born of shadows, forged from the darkness that he had summoned. "No." He breathed, the word a whisper, barely audible in the silence, but the shadows around her, they heard him, a guttural laugh. Low and cruel, escaped her lips, twisting Elwin's soul with its unearthly resonance. It was the sound of 1,000 tortured souls, of anguish that could never be soothed. "No, Elwin," Isadora spoke again, her voice a broken, distorted version of itself. "You cannot save me. You cannot save yourself." She lifted her hand toward him, and as she did, the room seemed to shudder, as though the very foundation of the manor was groaning under the weight of what had been unleashed. The shadows, which had once merely lurked in the corners, now moved freely, twisting and writhing, taking form, becoming more solid by the second. From the depths of the house, they came. The hollow ones, their grotesque figures emerged from every corner. Every crack in the walls, their twisted, decayed forms filling the room with their oppressive presence. Their eyes, empty, soulless voids, stared at him as they circled him, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators closing in on their prey. "You called us here," one of them spoke, its voice a rasping, unearthly sound. "And now you will pay the price." Elwin's mind, already fraying at the edges, spun wildly. He had sought knowledge, he had sought the impossible, and now he was drowning in the very darkness he had unleashed. The ritual, the book, the incantation, it had all been a trap. A trap of his own making. I didn't know," Elwin gasped, his voice cracking with desperation. "I just wanted her back. I just wanted to." "You wanted to conquer death," the voice from the shadows interrupted, mocking him. "But death is not something that can be conquered. It is not something that can be bargained with. You have opened the door, and now we have come." The walls seemed to close in on him, the air thickening, pressing down on him like a vice. The figures of the hollow ones moved closer, their eyes never leaving him. Isadora's form, if it could still be called that, stood at the forefront, her gaze locked onto his with an intensity that burned into his very soul. "You cannot undo what has been done," she repeated, her voice a chorus of agony and darkness. "You cannot take it back." Elwin's breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away, but the shadows followed him, creeping along the walls, filling every inch of space. His body was frozen in terror, and yet his mind screamed with the need to escape. There was no way out. The house, the manor, it had become his tomb. As he turned toward the door, he saw it, the truth. It was not Isadora's body that had been lost. It was his own. He had become one of them. He had become a hollow one. The realization hit him like a wave, drowning him in sorrow and regret. He had become the very thing he had feared. The very thing he had sought to avoid. The shadows closed in around him, and he could feel them, the cold, clammy hands of the lost souls, their fingers digging into his flesh, pulling him into the void. "No," he cried, his voice breaking. "No, I." But it was too late. The last sound he heard was the whisper of Isadora's voice, as cold as the grave. "You are ours now." And then, there was nothing. The manor stood as it always had, silent, still, and dark. Its walls had witnessed countless lives come and go, but none so broken as Elwin's. His soul, along with Isadora's, had been consumed by the shadows, swallowed whole by the curse he had unleashed, years past. The house remained empty, its doors locked tight, its windows boarded up. But those who passed by could still feel the weight of its presence, an ever-watchful, unblinking eye. And in the deepest corner of the house, in the darkest room of the manor, the hollow ones waited. They watched. They whispered, and they knew that there would always be another soul to claim.